Well, hi, Chris. It's great to have this conversation with you. And this is a truly transcontinental conversation because I'm here in North America in the early evening, and you are in Australia in the early morning, correct?
Absolutely right. I've had my coffee. I'm ready to go.
Okay, well, I've had plenty of coffee today. So I'm either ready to go or too ready to go. So let's start with some personal introductions. So anyone who's watching this or listening to this gets a bit of our background. They may not be familiar with us, and then we'll talk a bit about the series, the Great Thinkers series that we're contributing to. So why don't you start us off and tell us a bit about your personal background and where you're teaching now and your interests.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be a pleasure, James. I grew up in Yorkshire in the north of England and was educated down in the south of England in Cambridge, where I read modern and medieval languages, so French and German, a lot of literature in that degree, quite a bit of philosophy. I stuck around at Cambridge to do a PhD in modern French thought and then a postdoc and lectured there for a couple of years, at which point I met my wonderful wife, Alison, who's an Australian. And in 2011, we moved over to Melbourne, Australia, to Monash University, which is where I teach now, in a French department. So I teach the whole sort of swathe of French culture, literature, film, thought, politics, society. But the axis of my research is really in modern and contemporary French and European thought. So I package myself as a philosopher in what I publish, and what I write is articles and books on philosophy.
Excellent, excellent. Well, the funny thing is that we're both English, and neither of us are living in the country of our birth, or indeed the continent of our birth. So I'll just give my quick introduction here. So I was raised in the south of England in Wiltshire, so not so far away from Yorkshire in the grand scheme of things, but far enough away. And spent the latter part of my life, first part of my adult life in Scotland, in Glasgow, and then in Edinburgh. Studied engineering and computing in Edinburgh, and then took I don't know if it was a left turn or a right turn into philosophical theology. Developed a great interest in Christian philosophy and apologetics, and did a PhD in philosophical theology at the University of Edinburgh. And my topic was, a paradoxes in Christian theology and how we should think about those. And then subsequently, in the Lord's providence, was given the opportunity to move to Charlotte, North Carolina, to teach on faculty at Reformed Theological Seminary here in Charlotte. We've got campuses in several places, but I teach at the Charlotte campus, and I teach some systematic theology, some history of philosophy, ethics, apologetics, various things, a mixed bag of courses, jack of all trades, master of none, perhaps. But my interests are very much in line with Christian apologetics, and particularly the thought of Van Til. I think that's a shared interest for us. We'll maybe get onto that. Writing in topics in Reformed philosophical theology. Fantastic. And I'm married too.
Along the way.
I met my wife in Scotland, so that I didn't have to go too far to find a wife.
Wonderful.
Okay, well, let's get on to the topic of the Great Thinkers series, which is really why we're doing this conversation, to talk a bit about that and just to raise awareness of the series and talk a bit about our contributions to it. My contribution, I guess, will we'll get to a little later. And you've got actually, as we'll discover, three volumes in the series. We'll talk a bit about each of those. Let's talk about the series more generally. So the Great Thinkers series, published by P&R, Presbyterian and Reformed. And the basic idea behind the series, in case our listeners or viewers don't know, is short, concise, but academically informed and biblically and theologically orthodox introductions to major thinkers, great thinkers, not necessarily in the sense of being very impressive in their philosophy itself, although in some cases that is true, but perhaps in the sense of having an impact, influential thinkers, mainly in Western philosophy and thought, but not exclusively so, as I think we'll discover later in the series. And already there are volumes published on Thomas Aquinas, on Karl Marx, Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, your contributions, we'll get to those in a moment, Hegel, Richard Dawkins, interesting inclusion in the series there, Ransom Poitras writing that volume, and David Hume, the one that I've contributed, and there are several more in the work. So it's a very exciting series and quite a breadth of content, quite a diversity of thinkers, but the idea is to provide, as I say, theologically orthodox expositions and critiques of each thinker. So let me put this question to you, Chris. Why does this series matter? Why is it a good thing?
I think there are two things that this series is doing for me that made it a compelling choice for me to write in. The first, and this is gold dust for someone working in my area, is that it's treating thinkers one by one. So we're not, from my point of view as a scholar of postmodernism, we're not trying to lump all the mid-20th century French thinkers into one bucket and call it postmodernism and then try to say intelligent things about them, which is extremely hard to do with any level of rigor. We're able to take, for example, Derrida or Foucault in their own terms, not trying immediately to fit them into some bigger picture, but let them set things out as they want to set things out. And I jumped at the chance to do books like that. The second thing that I actually really enjoyed writing in this way, and hopefully it helps the reader as well, is the way in which these great series books are divided into two really quite distinct halves. And the first half of each book is really just letting the great thinker speak in their own voice. So not coming in with a biblical assessment or critique, but just saying, okay, what does Derrida, or what does Foucault, or what does Hume, what do they say? How do they see the world? What categories do they use? And just allowing them to in a sense, set their own table and invite us to their feast. And I think, certainly for the thinkers that I study, that's so important for groups such as Reformed and Evangelical Christians who would perhaps have an antipathy to this sort of thinking, to be able to just come to it and see, first of all, before we get into how to respond to it, what do they actually say? So I love that about this series. And then, of course, the second half is an engagement, a biblical, theological engagement with these thinkers, which I think is also incredibly important for Reformed Christians to be able to slow down and think through what a biblical or a Reformed response to an engagement with these thinkers might look like. And this series provides the opportunity to do that. So those are my two reasons why I jumped at the chance to write these books. But I'd be interested, James, to flip the question to you and say, what is it about the series that you really like?
Yeah, well, you've actually covered some of the ground that I would have mentioned. I really like the format as well. And I don't think that there's anything on the market that really is doing the same thing, namely providing very accessible introductions to these major thinkers But in the first half of the book, as you say, listening to what they're saying, saying, let's not jump in. Let's listen to them on their own terms. Let's try to understand what they're saying, where they're coming from, a little bit of their historical and philosophical context, and then once we have some confidence that we know where they're coming from and what they're talking about, then we can respond. Then we can bring our own Reformed Christian convictions and just a general rational evaluation to bear on their thoughts. So you've got the format where you try to understand the thinker and then do a critique, but also the theological ethos of the series, I think, is quite unique as well. I mean, there are plenty of Christian assessments out there of these thinkers. Some of them are evangelical in orientation, but as you and I think, agree that the Reformed tradition has some distinctive critical tools to bear on analyzing these thinkers, and so I think that makes a valuable contribution. And why do I think people in general should be interested in the series? I just think it's useful to know about these thinkers. It's part of a good education, a good rounded education, whatever you do in life, whatever you're involved in church ministry. It's just useful to understand some of these thinkers because they've had an impact. They've had an impact on the way people see the world, on academia, on politics, on culture, and we are all swimming in the river that they are upstream from, and they've contributed to. So just for the sake of cultural awareness and having a good rounded education, I think these are going to be important tools. So I'm excited to be able to contribute something to the series as well. Okay, Chris, well, let's turn to your first two contributions to the series. There is a third that we'll get to, but your first two are on Jacques Derrida, and you'll have to forgive me for not pronouncing his name with a French accent. I know that you will, but I'm just the dumb English guy living in America who can't pronounce these names correctly. But anyway, Jacques Derrida.
It's funny. It's funny you say that, James, because I had an undergraduate lecturer who insisted on the fact that in English it's not Derrida, it's Derrida. And that each language has its own pronunciation. So you're absolutely consistent with what I was taught.
Okay, all right. Sounds a little relativistic, but I'll roll with it. Okay, and then Michel Foucault, but we'll hold him back for a second while we focus on Derrida for a moment, because this was the first book that you wrote for the series. Now, why Derrida? Why were you interested to contribute a book to this series on Derrida?
Yeah, I think it's largely to do with the extent of his influence and impact, both within academia and more broadly on the way that people think and the reflexes that people have faced with different situations today. So within academia, one can pick up pretty quickly any number of quotations saying he's the most significant philosopher of the second half of the 20th century and so forth. And for what they're worth, quotations like that do begin to paint a picture of someone who has had a significant impact, or at least is perceived to have had at least a significant impact on the way that we think. He engages with important fundamental questions. He's in that sense radical. The level at which he's seeking to engage with the way that we think is at the root of everything. So, for example, the relationship between truth and meaning, or between meaning and language, has implications for all fields of human endeavor. He's got important things to say about ethics and the way in which we think of the world in terms of the lenses of good and evil. And again, that runs deep and wide in the way that we organize our society and the way that we engage with the world as individuals. And of course, he's got a deal to say about God as well, which is, as we would no doubt both agree, fundamental to what it means
it's pretty important
to be human. he's also incredibly prolific and broad. In researching the Great Thinkers book, I dug up about 86, it was, I think, book-length treatments of Derrida. So Derrida and architecture, Derrida and zoology, and everything in between. So his thought can be set to work across the whole gamut of human endeavor. And I think he's important also for what he tells us perhaps about the tribalism of contemporary academia. You know of, and I mention in the book, what's called the Cambridge Affair, the way in which in 1992, I think it was, he was under great protest awarded an honorary degree at Cambridge, and that how that really split the academic body between those who considered him essentially an intellectual terrorist, a charlatan, who the quote at the time was, like the Dadaists, wants to do nothing but wreck the academy, and those who, by contrast, including the people who taught me as an undergraduate, said, for goodness sake, this is a real philosopher, just read him. And I think that tells us something interesting about the contemporary academic climate as well. So for all those reasons, I think he's a really important thinker.
Well, let's deal with the skeptics head on, because no doubt there are a few people, maybe listening, watching this, who have heard the Derrida skeptics, the claim that he's not a real philosopher, that he's really just a joker, he's playing around, he's the court jester in the courtroom of philosophy, and even didn't Foucault say something rather rude about him? So even in his own camp, it seems that there's some dissent. So how would you address the skeptics who say there's nothing useful to see here?
Yeah, I think first of all, in relation to the fool idea, I would just point people to Shakespeare's fools and say that the fool is not always a peripheral or trivial character. But more seriously, I think there are a number of very unhelpful caricatures of Derrida that circulate and act as, to coin a phrase, defeater beliefs that stop people engaging with his thought. One of the main ones is that he thinks that language is meaningless and that it can mean anything we want it to. There's essentially an arbitrariness about language. And I think if he did think that, I wouldn't have written a book on him. And I don't think that that's what he thinks. What he does say, quite powerfully, I think, is that the way that we use language and the structure of our language is open to new meanings. And in the book, I use the example of a barber shop to try and illustrate what this means. So when I used to get my haircut as an undergraduate, I went to a lovely barber's, Italian-owned barber shop called Carmelo. And it had outside one of those old-fashioned red and white striped barbershop poles in order to identify it. And one day I was walking past Carmelo's on Jesus Lane, and I noticed that some scaffolding had come up outside it, and lo and behold, this scaffolding also had red and white striped tape on it to tell people not to bump into the scaffolding. And so what have we got at that point? We've got two instances of the same sign, if you like, red and white stripes, one of which is saying, please come in here if you want to have your haircut, and the other one is saying, watch out, don't bump into the scaffolding. Now, people have no problem telling those two contexts apart. You don't get people queuing up outside building sites waiting to get their haircut, and you don't get builders walking into barbershops asking if there's any work that needs to be done. The context determines the meaning of the red and white stripes in both of those cases. But that context is not riveted down forever. Red and white stripes could in the future have other possible meanings. Imagine the new sort of multinational global firm, the successor to Google, whoever that is, and they decide to have a logo with red and white stripes in. That would then become, in most people's minds, the dominant meaning. When people see red and white stripes, they would immediately think of this particular company. And another example of that would be the date 9/11. Before 2001, it was various people's birthday. It might have had significance here and there, but suddenly the primary meaning of that date changed for almost everybody. And what that illustrates in both these cases is that the context of these signs is open. But it's not only sort of open in the future. It's not only that things could take on different meanings in the future. It's that it's very hard, I think Derrida would say impossible, to exhaustively determine content and context in the present. So, for example, the red and white stripes outside Carmelo's barbershop. Now, I assume that they're there simply because it's a barber's, and that's the conventional sign for indicating that it's a barbershop. But it may be that the owner of the barbershop is a fan of the soccer team Atletico Madrid, who play in red and white stripes. And so he thought how fitting it would be for my shop to sport the colour of my team. And that would, if I knew that, that would change what I thought about those particular red and white stripes outside the shop. The context has enlarged. I know more about where that particular instance of red and white stripes come from, and so that I would read it differently. And in a sense, there's no place where I know that I can securely stop in exploring that context. There are more things that I could find out about this particular instance of red and white stripes, or Derrida would say there's more things I can find out about any context. Perhaps a good illustration of that would be the play Hamlet. People are still writing about forgotten or neglected aspects of the context of Hamlet that might change certain aspects of our interpretation of it. So meaning isn't arbitrary. It's not that red and white stripes can mean whatever I want them to mean. I'll just make up a silly meaning for them, and that's what they mean for me. Absolutely not. But red and white stripes are open in their context. They might gain new meanings in the future, and any particular instance of them might have shades of meaning that I've not yet discovered. And finally, Derrida would say red and white stripes, or any sign, don't mean anything in and of themselves abstracted from any context. So if I just say red and white stripes, what do they mean? I think that a natural question will be, well, are they outside a barber shop? Are they on a construction site? Are they on a soccer shirt? And you need some sort of context to determine what they mean in any particular instance. They don't have any intrinsic meaning all to themselves.
Okay, well, that sounds reasonable and plausible, but let me play devil's advocate for a little minute here. And suppose that the objection is not that Derrida thinks that language is meaningless, but that it has too much meaning, in that because context can change and there's an infinite number of contexts, then a text or a pole outside a barbershop or whatever can take on any number of meanings, and there's no right answer here. There's no determinative meaning. There's nothing that anchors meaning in some objective reality or some objective standard. And take your Hamlet example. So people are still debating about the meaning of Hamlet, and part of me wants to say, well, Hamlet is what Shakespeare meant, right? I mean, that's what fixes the meaning. But Derrida, to many years, seems to be saying something more radical, because if that's all he's saying, then that's nothing new. There's nothing very interesting about the idea that meaning is determined by context. So is there something more radical that he's saying? And if so, is it a problem?
I think there are two questions there. I'll take the second one first. Is there anything more radical that he's saying? I think what he is saying is that we haven't understood how radical that is. So we are happy to assent to the idea that context determines meaning, but we don't follow that through. What then does that mean for these ideas that we vaunt as universal, whether they be ethical ideas in terms of human rights or ideas of truth and falsehood? I think that the radicality comes in the way that he's ruthless in taking what you've, I think, quite rightly framed there as essentially a banal observation that most people would agree with, and saying, okay, where does that lead us then? If that's really the case, where do we end up? And I think what is interesting, compelling about Derrida's thought is that he implacably pursues that thought, and he doesn't let go. He doesn't get off the bus halfway, and he tries to follow through on, okay, what does that then mean if meaning is context dependent in that way, for the way that we see the world, for the way that we think about society and ethics and so forth.
Good. Okay, that's helpful. Okay, let's move things on a little bit here. So you're not the first Christian thinker to write on Derrida, is that correct?
Yes, there've been a couple.
There've been a couple more. Okay, so there's no doubt a range of Christian assessments of Derrida, and probably some dispute about his value and what can be drawn from it. So just give us a brief survey of the landscape of Christian views of Derrida.
I'll be as brief as I can. There's a lot of different Christian views. I've identified about 7 of them, different ways of seeking to engage with or appropriating Derrida, and it would work for Foucault and other so-called postmodern thinkers as well. The first 2 are the least interesting 2. They're the 2 extremes of interpretation, one of which is to say that Derrida and Foucault and others are unremittingly, irredeemably evil, that they have nothing to say of any worth whatsoever. And this sort of knee-jerk view often identifies them with whatever bogeyman is circulating in the culture at the time. So we've had, Derrida is at fault for post-truth and Foucault is at fault for alternative facts, and they tend to be convenient pegs upon which to hang that which we dislike. At the other end of the spectrum, there are interpreters who think that these writers are the future of the church. That this is what Christian thought, Christian theology needs to become and take on board in order to progress into the 21st century. So Karl Raschke, for example, has this book entitled The Next Reformation, and he thinks that in order to be true to its Reformation heritage, Christianity needs to enfold and remake itself in the image of these thinkers in order to continue to be the Christianity that it is. Or from a non-Christian point of view, Slavoj Žižek has a book, the subtitle of which, Why the Christian Legacy is Worth Fighting For. And for him, it's not because it's Christian, but because it contains a kernel of militant political activism that he wants to rescue from Christianity as its truth, sort of throwing away the Christian husk. So those, if you like, mark the 2 extreme points of the way in which people have engaged with these ideas. On that spectrum, you've got positions such as the idea that these thinkers are cast in the role of Christian prophets. And this is Merelt Westphal's line in the previous generation of thinkers, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. He sees them as having a prophetic role, drawing the attention of Christians to things that we may have neglected or become blind to in our own tradition. And he sees a line of continuity between the Old Testament prophets, Jesus's critique of religion, and the critique of religion that you find in Marx and Freud and Nietzsche. You also get sort of variations of this, for example, Bruce Benson's Graven Ideologies, how Derrida, Marion and others can help us to see the ideologies and idolatries to which Christians and others are prone. There's also a way of engaging with these thinkers as preparatio evangelica, that they clear the ground and make straight paths for the gospel message. They follow through the consequences of what it means to be in a world without God, such that the Christian apologists can then come in and say, well, if that's what you're left with, if you don't have God, let me show you what God can bring and the way that the world can look a lot more attractive with God in the picture. And there are two modes of this. You can either do this negatively as a sort of cautionary tale, look how bad the world is without God, and therefore look why you need him, or you can do it in a much more positive way. So see how these thinkers struggle to arrive at the ethical principles they know they need to get to. See how hard it is to live in the world without God, and therefore see what belief in God can bring to those issues that are not there. Another way of, I suppose, a mode of non-engagement with these thinkers is simply to say that, look, they have nothing to do with the gospel and with Christian theology whatsoever. They're operating in two parallel universes, almost. It's something akin to a nature-grace dichotomy. Derrida and Foucault tell us about this world, fair enough, but then Christian theology tells us about ultimate reality of the world to come. And you see bits of this coming through in thinkers such as Jacques Derrida in his Presence of the Kingdom, the idea that there's a big divide between these two realms. Another way, I've only got two to go, don't worry, another way of thinking of these thinkers is seeing them as Christian heretics. So essentially they're taking what are fundamentally Christian theological ideas and they're twisting them and misrepresenting them. So you often get the language of this thinker is producing a secular version of salvation. Or again, Westphal will often say that these thinkers are plagiarizing Christian theology and reducing the full orbed Christian witness to certain elements of it taken out of context and so forth, which would be articulated within a theological frame as heresy. And finally, the last important way that I think Christian thinkers have engaged with Foucault, Derrida, and others is to see them, to read them against themselves as symptoms of that which they reject. So Foucault and Derrida will reject sort of foundationalist, universalist modernism, and writers such as John Milbank and David Bentley Hart, an important part of what they say will be, well, these writers are actually part of that modernism that they are trying to reject because they are symptoms of it. They're reacting against it in ways that play to its categories, even as they try to disrupt those categories. And so those, I think, are the main ways in which Christians are engaged. And of course, the question that naturally follows from that is, well, which of those is right? And the line that I take on that is the line that Don Carson takes in his book Christ and Culture Revisited, when he's looking at Niebuhr's 5 categories of the way in which Christ and culture relates. And Carson essentially says that it isn't a case of choosing one of these and rejecting all of the others, as if one of these were the truth of how we should engage and all the others had nothing going for them. There's a sensitivity to context and to what we're trying to achieve in a particular engagement that will mean that each of these modes, certainly the less radical ones, knocking off the 2 extremes, each of these modes will have its moment in a full-orbed Christian engagement with these thinkers. I think that's a really healthy position to take, rather than trying to pick one of these and sort of nail one's colours to that mast, to say that each of these will have its moment as we carefully work through a Christian response to these thinkers.
Is that then the Christian critique that says postmodernism is ultimately hyper-modernism? It's modernism on steroids. Is that the idea?
It's partly that, but I think it's more fundamental than that. It's that postmodernism lets modernism set the rules of the game and then reacts. So it takes Descartes, for example, and the individual cogito as that which must be engaged with, and then it has various ways of deconstructing and messing around with the cogito in order to show that it doesn't do what Descartes wants it to do. Whereas I think a more radical critique, and this is what I try and point out in the books, a biblical critique, would be to to deny Descartes' terms of reference to begin with, to say that we don't need to start there, and indeed we shouldn't start with the individual cogito. There's a much richer account of Trinitarian reality that means that we never have to begin with Descartes to begin with. And so it's in as much as they accept the terms of reference delegated to them, if you like, by modernism, that it's almost an argument that says, well, I wouldn't start there.
But there's not a constructive proposal about where one should start, or at least not an ultimately satisfying one. Is that fair?
Well, yes. I mean, in a sense, it's hard to reproach people for starting where they are and where their culture is. So that the sort of majority non-theological Western culture has been shaped by Descartes and Hobbes and Hume, as you will know better than I do, and so forth. And so in starting with these thinkers, I don't think it's necessarily a fault of theirs, but it's something that the Christian looks at and says, well, I have resources that are unavailable to you. I can engage with a reality that doesn't have to trace its way through modern and early modern European thought. I'm not beholden to Hobbes and to what John Milbank would talk about as his sort of ontology of power, the way in which society is fundamentally structured around ideas of power. I don't need to start there. In fact, I don't want to start there, and I shouldn't start there, because I have an account of reality in the Bible where the intra-Trinitarian relationships of love are more fundamental than any brute ontology of power in society. And so rather than sort of wagging the finger at Derrida and Foucault for doing this, because in a sense, where else would one want them to start? I think the Christian can come along and say, look, I have resources that are unavailable to them for thinking about this. So let's see what happens when you start with the Trinity instead.
Derrida's probably his most famous statement is, there is nothing outside the text.
Indeed
now
it is.
That's clearly crazy, right? Because, for example, an ambulance just went past in the outside the window, okay? That's not it. That's not a text, okay? There's a world out there, real world of trees and buildings and people. So nothing outside the text. That's just an example of Derrida playing games with us.
Okay, that's just an example of people playing games with Derrida, I think. Taking one sentence, assuming to know what it means out of its context, which of course is always important for Derrida, and then using it as a stick to beat him. Let me try and unpack what I think there is nothing outside the text means, and why this is a helpful way of thinking about it. It helps to work from the French. It's not necessarily a terrible translation. There's nothing outside the text, but it says more and says differently to what the French say. So in the French, it's il n'y a pas de hors texte. Literally, there is no outside text, where outside text is a noun. And let's start with that now. So un hors texte, a outside text in French is the normal word for a frontispiece, a piece of a paper stuck into the front of a bound volume. Might contain an illustration of a particularly important event from that book, or it might contain a sort of a dedication page. But what's important for Derrida is that it's stuck in. It's not part of the book itself. It comes to it from the outside, but it contains some authority over the text. It explains it in some sense. So it either says this is an important or indicative event in the book that we're illustrating, or this tells you something about where the book came from. And so what is it? It's something that comes from outside and has a certain authority over the content that it becomes part of. And so what Derrida is saying is that in life, there is nothing that comes from the outside that gives an authoritative reading of what we experience. There's nothing above the level of experience to interpret it for us. And one way of sort of flashing that out is that, well, there isn't a God for him. But there's also other parts of the sentence that are significant. So this whole idea of there is, il y a, we might think that's a very innocuous phrase in English, but in French and the German that it comes from, there's a very rich theological heritage. So Heidegger has the idea of the es gibt, the there is, that which is present to my consciousness, that which I can contemplate. And so that the there is has quite a heavy philosophical sense of something that is there before me that I can engage with and contemplate, that is almost an object to my subject. And so if we try and put those two ideas together, what an hors-texte is and what the philosophical weight of there is, we come out with something like, there's nothing that's present to my consciousness as what it is that comes from outside to give an authoritative, this is quite long, isn't it? To give an authoritative explanation and interpretation of reality. So he's not saying, and I don't think he would have ever gained the reputation that he has if he had been saying, everything is books or everything is language. The ambulance outside your window is simply text, is simply language. But what he would say about the ambulance outside your window is that it is present to your consciousness as what it is. In other words, you interpret the noises that hit your eardrum as a siren because of certain cultural baggage that you bring. You've heard sirens before, you know what they sound like, you know that it's likely that a noise like that, heard where you are, is going to be an ambulance. And so it is present to your consciousness as what it is, in other words, as an ambulance siren, rather than just as an inexplicable noise, in a particular way.
Okay, that's pretty good for a few minutes explanation of this this difficult concept. I guess the longer answer is read the book, because you do get into it at some length, right?
That's right. Yeah, if you're confused by what I just said, then feel free to confuse yourself further by reading the book.
No, quite the contrary. I think that was a good preview of the discussion. Something else about your book that I thought was really helpful was you did something that not many people have done, which is to bring Derrida into conversation with Van Til. Not a lengthy conversation, but nonetheless, you make the claim that actually these two thinkers have some things in common. There are some similar insights, although the application is rather different. So can you give us a preview of your discussion there?
Let me just take one example of that. I talk about the way in which Derrida is very careful to think about what, in a sense, what we're allowed to know. So if we start from where he starts, what can we know, and what is unavailable to our knowledge? And of course, Van Til is very insistent upon epistemological self-consciousness himself, that we don't overshoot what our ontology allows us to know in terms of what we claim to know. And so I think there's a healthy self-reflexivity in both thinkers, certainly on that level.
What then would be the major insights that you think that Christians can draw from Derrida? What use would he be to a Christian thinker?
It's a really interesting way to pose the question, isn't it? It assumes, and this is not a critique of the question, but it assumes that what we do when we engage with these thinkers as Christians is try to get something out of them, try to, if you like, appropriate the Egyptian gold and then repatriate it, which is fair enough, but I don't think it's the only thing that happens when we read people like this. And what I try to do in the book is paint a broader picture of what is at stake when Reformed readers engage with thinkers like Derrida and Foucault, beyond simply what can we learn from them? What can we take out of their thought in order to enhance or nuance the way that we think? And one way that I try to explore that in the book is by taking an approach that focuses on the problems that they're dealing with. So what does Derrida think it's worth thinking about? What does he think is an issue? And similarly for Foucault. And then allowing a reformed theological view to engage with those same problems, and then say, okay, what would a biblical, what would a reformed response to those same issues look like? And I think one thing that does is it helps us both to understand the thinkers better in their own right, I think, because we're comparing them to something that's starting from a very different position, and so we're sharpening our understanding of what exactly they say. But we're also showing how the Bible lends itself, I think, to being a very powerful and very nuanced tool of cultural criticism and cultural theory in a way that's not often, I think, brought out in the way that people use the Bible to engage with these sort of thinkers. So one example might be that in the book, I try and introduce this idea of diagonalization, which is the way in which biblical categories just don't conform to the way that these thinkers are thinking about the world. And one example of that might be the modernism and postmodernism dichotomy. So there's, very broadly speaking, a modernity that thinkers like Foucault and Derrida see as problematic, that they're trying to disrupt in certain ways, and we call that disruption postmodernism. And then the question arises, well, where does the Bible fit within that dichotomy of modernism and postmodernism? And the answer that I try to argue in the book is that it doesn't. It is neither modern nor postmodern, but for a really interesting reason, that it sets up the categories in which both modernism and postmodernism deal very differently, and shows actually that they have a great deal in common, that often is hard for them to acknowledge. So modernism and postmodernism share a fundamental assumption that whatever it is that is most fundamental in the universe, to the extent that we can know it, is impersonal. And that has huge implications for the way that both of those positions articulate themselves and engage with each other. But of course, for a biblical point of view, for a reformed theological point of view, that couldn't be further from the truth, that the most fundamental thing there is God, and he is tripersonal, and can't be reduced to something that is impersonal, constituent parts of God that are not themselves personal. It's simply not the way the Bible thinks. And so the Bible cuts across this shared assumption that whatever position we take, we must hold the idea that ultimate reality is impersonal, and in a sense changes the game from that point on. A universe in which the most fundamental reality is personal will cash itself out in radically different ways, and really excitingly different ways, than both modernism and postmodernism. And it's by trying to set Derrida and Foucault and the Bible alongside each other and say, well, let's see in their own terms how they both respond to the sort of problems that are raised by Derrida and Foucault, that we get to that sort of way of engaging with them.
Let's turn to the Foucault book now. And I have to begin with a confession that I've read your book on Derrida and very much appreciate it, but I have not had the chance to get into the Foucault book yet. So and my ignorance will be on full display during this segment.
Well, let me do my best to whet your appetite.
Yes, exactly. I'll be the guinea pig here. So again, why Foucault? What makes him interesting enough to write a book on?
Yeah, absolutely. I was surprised to find when I was researching the book that he is the most cited researcher across the arts, humanities, and sciences of all time, at least by one measure. It's the Google citation measure. He comes out first. He's in front of Freud, Marx, Einstein, and he's way out in front of the second most cited author on that list, who is interestingly Pierre Bourdieu. So to what extent we take that as an absolute indication of his academic breadth, it gives us some sense of the fact that he is incredibly read and incredibly well cited across the whole range of academic disciplines. I told one of my friends that I was writing a book on Foucault and theology, and his reaction was, I can't wait for it to come out. My son has just done Foucault in geography at university.
Wow.
So Foucault is everywhere. And his thoughts are, for many people, incredibly explanatory and revelatory of the way in which society today works. The concepts that he gives us, disciplinary power, for example, for many people have a great revelatory power. They show us the way in which society gets people to do things today. And so both in terms of his sheer academic footprint, which is enormous, by some measures unparalleled, and also by the way in which he draws our attention to certain workings in society and the way that he's able to cash those out. I think he's in the forefront of thinkers with whom everybody needs to engage to some extent, from whatever stable or particular position they're coming.
Perhaps the main thing that people will know about Foucault, if they know anything at all, is the idea that knowledge should be understood as power plays, or some attempt to exert power. And for some people, that's a very attractive idea. And for others, it's one that they think is patently false. Why does it matter?
Why does it matter whether power is that important?
Why does it matter? Whatever Foucault means by that, yeah. Why is that an important claim?
Okay. Let me first deal with what he does mean, and then I'll try and indicate why that is important. So he doesn't say, and this is one of the myths that unfortunately circulates about him, that everything is power, that there is nothing apart from power. He does say in the first volume of his History of Sexuality that power is everywhere, but then he immediately adds, but it is not everything. It's everywhere not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. So, in other words, there are certain relationships, there are certain things in society. I think kinship relations is one example that's used, that is not all about power, and yet there is no part of it that is untouched by flows and dynamics of power. And he understands power as acting upon the action of others. So it's not just state power, it's not just coercion, top-down coercion, but it's for Foucault a much more fine-grained account of power moving in all sorts of different directions, not simply from those we would consider to be the more powerful to the less powerful, but in many complex ways in society. And I think it's important for Christians. I think it's important in two ways. First of all, it shows what a way of looking at the world that takes its cue from Hobbes and particularly Nietzsche and others looks like. This is what society is if the reality of power and will and so forth is fundamental. I think it's important for Christians to see and understand and engage with that. And also, I think for the way in which the categories and the shifts that he points to in society tell us really interesting things about our society. One example of these would be the way that he deals with Christian confession. He sees confession as a central plank of Christianity historically. But the way that he sees that playing out in the 20th century is that our whole society has become confessional. That the whole enterprise of psychoanalysis is a modulation of confession. The way in which he claims that we need to express our deepest realities, our deepest desires, often sexual desires, that the way that we need to voice those is a development from a Christian understanding of confession. And so I think one thing that's really interesting for Christians and important is the way in which Foucault can help us to see how society is has taken certain key Christian ideas or ideas from the Christian tradition and reworked them, and therefore how contemporary society is shot through with these theological or traditionally Christian ways of thinking and acting as well.
So a lot of, I think, readers or at least observers of Foucault will get the impression that he denies that there's objective truth. He denies that there are objective norms of morality and rationality, and so he must be a relativist, and relativism is bad. So what can we what a value can we find in someone who's a relativist? Now, I know that's simplistic, but it is an impression that a lot of Christians have got insofar as they've heard anything of his work. To what extent is it a fair characterization, and to what extent does it need to be nuanced?
I think I would want to ask relative to what. So there is a sense in which, for Foucault, truth is relative to a particular historico-cultural period, that the way that we construct truth and what we count as truth has changed over time. And he tries to show in his archaeologies and then later in his genealogies how different societies have counted different things as truth. So he talks about, for example, how in the early modern world, a lot of play was made of analogies, that things that looked similar had similar properties, and that meaning and truth were constructed along analogical lines. And then when you get into Descartes, for example, reason plays a much more front and center role, and therefore what we take to be truth, the mechanisms through which we produce truth in society shift over time. So in that sense, truth as a construct is relative to the society that's constructing it. And we might think today of the different ways in which reality is viewed in Western societies and in some more traditional societies that both have an idea of truth, but it's not the same thing. Different things count as contributing to that idea. And so truth is relative in that sense, but I think there's also a very important danger to avoid in conceding that for Foucault truth is relative, and that's that he by no means wants to be heard to be saying that we all individually construct our ideas of truth for ourselves and we can take truth to be whatever we want, and in that sense of relativism he would vigorously reject. The moment in his work that's often turned to when people are trying to explain what he means by truth is a quote where he says, "Truth is a thing of this world. It's produced by virtue of multiple forms of constraint." I think there are two important things there. First of all, that truth is imminent to our experience. There's nothing from outside this world that parachutes in, for Foucault, to tell us what truth is, and part of that would be that there is no God. And secondly, that truth is always constructed. It's always the result of certain institutions within society, certain practices. If we think of science, for example, in the way that it's undergirded by a whole system of laboratories, peer-reviewed journals, conventions for how one expresses things, languages, all of these form part, for Foucault, of the institutional infrastructure of truth, and that varies over time and between cultures, and so each culture will be constructing what it counts as truth in its own way.
So for Foucault, truth is not an individual construct, but it is a societal construct, or more broadly, a human construct, insofar as that there would not be truth were it not for us, for our language, our cultural practices, and so forth. So he's a certain kind of relativist, but not another kind of relativist, not a very crude relativist, but still there's a sort of constructivism that's going on here. Yeah. Now, okay, go ahead, come up.
No, it's just that there's one slight uneasiness that I have with describing him as a relativist there is that it assumes that there's something unchanging that we are calling truth that is then expressed relatively in each culture. And I think he would resist that idea of a universal idea of truth that is then sort of instantiated variously in different cultures. I think he would want to say that each culture is constructing in its own way what it chooses to count as real or meaningful or truthful in a way that doesn't allow us to abstract from that some sort of acultural or universal idea that we're going to call truth that is then cashing itself out differently in different societies. Right.
That's helpful. But that's even more radical. It's one thing to say that truths, plural, whatever instantiates truth, varies over time across cultures. But to say that the very nature of truth itself, the concept of truth, is also subject to historical contingencies, that's pretty radical, right?
Yeah, it is. And from his point of view, it's a product. Truth is a product of the institutions and practices of a particular society. And as those institutions and practices differ between societies, then what they produce and what that society agrees to accept as truth will change. Yes, it is. It is a radical position, which is part of the reason why Foucault and Derrida and others are important thinkers, that what they're saying strikes very deep in the way that we think about the world.
Now, I want to pick up on almost a passing comment that you made earlier with reference to Foucault's view of God or the absence thereof. Is it fair to say that Foucault's philosophy is premised on atheism, or is that too simplistic?
He doesn't engage with theology, certainly. So when he looks at the history of Christianity, it's Christian practices that he's interested in, confession being an example. He doesn't engage with doctrines of redemption or anything like that. I think it's expressing it in a way that cuts with the grain of his concerns. I think one would say that he's just not interested in that side of things. He's looking at the way in which societies have worked in the past and the practices that they've maintained, and holding a position on God is not part of that.
Now, earlier I asked what insights Christians could draw from Derrida, and you came back and said, well, maybe we shouldn't have an approach that's simply looking for what we can plunder, plundering the Egyptians, and what insights can we just pull out of this, and that point is well taken. So let me phrase the question with respect to Foucault a little differently, so I don't fall into the same trap. What would be the value for a Christian of knowing about Foucault's thought and reading a book by a fellow Christian about Foucault's thought?
I think there'd be at least two things to say in relation to that. The first would be to reiterate the idea that Foucault is not only very widely read and cited, but held to have really important insights into the way that society works, that one doesn't need to subscribe to his way of looking at the world in order to derive benefit from and insight into the way that society works. I think there's an added benefit, though, for Christians in engaging with his work, in that again he helps, or certainly helped me, to sharpen my idea of what the Bible is saying, not because he told me what the Bible is saying, but because the way in which he approaches problems led me to dig deeply into, well, what would a biblical response or a biblical account of that sort of theme look like, and particularly in relation to power. What became clear to me as I tried to wrestle with how to bring the Bible into conversation with Foucault was that the biblical, the way in which power plays itself out in the plotline of the Bible is radically different to Foucault. And the way that I ended up expressing this in the book was that Foucault's account of power is linear. There's an unbroken sequence of expressions of power that's never really subverted or, to use a Derridian term, deconstructed in any way. But by contrast, the Bible has a radically subversive account of power that's expressed most powerfully in the cross and resurrection of Christ. And so I focus on two passages in the book. Philippians 2, Christ, being in very nature God, etc., did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, made himself a servant, and then was exalted by God to the highest place. And note that it's Christ who does the humbling, but then the subject of the verb changes, and it's God who exalts him. So that there's a sense in which there's a dislocation at the moment of the cross there. It's not Christ who is in control the whole time, that he humbles himself to death, and then it is God who exalts him to the highest place. And I try and understand that and show that to be a non-linear moment, an unexpected break in the continuity of power. And I try and show that as well in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul is talking about the values that are precious to the Greeks and the Jews. And the Greeks love wisdom, the Jews love power and miraculous signs. And Paul very impishly argues that, well, if you really want the fullness of those things that you're searching, you need to go to the place where you would least expect to find them. And so, Jews, if you're looking for power, why don't you come to the powerlessness of a man dying helpless on a cross? Because, paradoxically, that is where you will find God's power, ultimate power, true power. And again, there's a rupture of expectations. There's a stopping short in our understanding of what power is, and an upending of the concept of power. That the greatest manifestation of power should be in this symbol of abject weakness and abject powerlessness. And I try to build then an biblical understanding of power on that idea of rupture and non-linearity, and then bring that into conversation with Foucault and say, well, then how are the Bible and Foucault thinking about power, and how do those two ways of thinking compare to each other?
Well, just to tie up this section where we're talking about your books, what did you personally gain from writing these two books in particular?
Yeah, I gained a deeper an ever deeper sense of the untapped resources that there are in the Bible for elaborating a distinctive approach to cultural theory. As was one of the main things that the more I dug in the Bible, the more I saw that there are fresh, compelling, interesting, constructive ways of coming at the questions that these philosophers are thinking about from a biblical base, that aren't often exploited and talked about. So one example would be the way that the Bible cashes out power in a way that subverts exploitation and authority, and I go into that in the book. And it's really embedded, I guess, deep within me, the sense that we need people who are Reformed Christians and who work in philosophy really need to be developing a full-orbed biblical cultural theory, both for our own benefit and our understanding of how the Bible relates to questions that are going on in society, but also, we hope and pray for the good of society, to provide fresh responses to problems from a biblical point of view. So that's one thing that the more I look at these thinkers in relation to the Bible, the more I think, my goodness, the Bible has a lot to offer to these questions, with a freshness and a compellingness that is, I think, quite rare. And I suppose another thing that I've become increasingly convinced of is that the Bible can be brought into productive conversation with Derrida and Foucault and other postmodern thinkers in a way that neither simply praises them and sees them as the next Reformation, nor simply tries to destroy them. That there is a biblically faithful, rigorous, academically rigorous and theologically rigorous way of getting the Bible and thinkers like Derrida and Foucault to talk to each other, that sells neither of those two parties short. That a real conversation can be had, and it's a productive and enlightening conversation when that happens.
That's good. So in a sense, on the one hand, we want to treat these thinkers as creatures made in the image of God and give them the respect and the hearing that goes with that, but also recognizing that they're fallen people who are going to manifest all the kinds of intellectual rebellion and idolatry that are common to fallen humanity, and bring a biblical perspective to bear on that. Is that fair?
Yep. One way of putting that would be they are neither stupid nor God.
Very happy. Okay, well, before we move on, you have a third book in the works. You've been extremely productive, and the last one is in the I think the relatively final stages. So why don't you just tell us a bit about that book, its topic, and when we can expect it to hit the shelves?
Yeah, thank you. From when I wrote the first book on Derrida, I always had the ambition to do three: Derrida, Foucault, and the third one is Gilles Deleuze. And I see them as the three most important and influential thinkers that get sort of labeled as postmodern thinkers. Foucault himself said that the coming period, the century to come, will be Deleuzian. And I try to argue in the Deleuze book that is to a large extent what we've seen. And if Foucault and Derrida are very helpful for understanding where we've come from and how modernity has got to where it's got, then perhaps Deleuze is the thinker who most fully explains where we are and where we're going as a society. And so I think he's incredibly important and influential as a thinker. And I've also really both been challenged and energized by how to engage with his thought in particular from a reformed position. So I've had to almost reinvent my approach with each of these three books. In Derrida, I thought that the best way to engage his thought in a way that did justice both to his thought and the Bible was to go through the prologue to John's Gospel, which raises many of the same concerns that Derrida is dealing with. In terms of Foucault, again, it was a particular passage or two passages that I thought would really get to the heart of both what he's saying and provide a productive conversation, which is Philippians 2 and 1 Corinthians 1.
Mm.
But with Deleuze, I just quickly came to the conclusion that there's no single biblical passage or even single biblical book that will allow us to engage the whole of Deleuze's thought. And so I've taken a biblical theological approach in the Deleuze book, sweeping through from creation through fall, redemption, and consummation, and trying to show how what I'm calling an emplotted biblical approach will both allow us to engage with Deleuze's thought in its own terms, but also highlight really important points at which the biblical narrative differs from the way in which he is understanding the world. And along the way, I've discovered some new ways of, I guess, thinking biblically. So one example discovered for me, I'm not suggesting that I'm the first person to think in this way, but they became part of my own theological vocabulary through studying Deleuze. One example would be the way in which Christianity is stubbornly historical. The claim is that the most important reality is not a reality that's disengaged from this world, but Christ became incarnate. God was, as John says in the opening verses of the first of his letters, we could touch and see and hear this Christ, this God. So there's if you like, a scandal of the material there, that ultimate reality was incarnate materially. There's a scandal of the historical, that Christ came on a particular calendar day in history. We're not talking about an abstract universal reality that's detached from the historical record, but the incarnation happened on a particular day, which is, for many modern ways of thinking, a really scandalous approach. I think Richard Dawkins is scandalized both by the materiality and the historicity of Christ. He sees it as very parochial. That God would come in a particular first century Jewish man rather than being a universal principle. And the third scandal is the temporal, in that human and world history is unrepeatable, and it has a meaning. In a Christian understanding of time, is that it's going somewhere, it's building towards an eschaton. And I think that is also uncomfortable for many modern readers. And so that I've been energized and challenged by the way in which engaging with Deleuze has forced me to think differently in terms of the way in which I engaged the Bible with his thought, to the way that I became familiar with in terms of Derrida and Foucault.
That's great. So would it be fair to say that this third book is really for readers who want to know the future of postmodernism, or what the state of the art is? This is a newer generation of postmodern thinkers.
I think it's useful for two things. It's useful for understanding where we are now. A lot of the debates and positions that are taken in society, across society today, are powerfully explained by Deleuzian ideas. So I think if you want to understand where we are now, it's really important. But I think it does also, Deleuze does also indicate where society may be going. I mean, none of us knows for certain, of course, and I wouldn't, and I'm sure nor would he claim with any sort of definitiveness that the future will certainly be Deleuzian, but it shows indications of going in that direction. And therefore, if we understand his thought, we can, to some extent, have an educated guess as to where things are heading. Yes, well, with great delight, I am looking forward to digging into David Hume with you. I very much enjoyed reading your Hume volume in the Great Series, the Great Thinkers series. I think it's not to flatter you too much face to face, but I think it's not only incredibly helpful as an introduction to Hume, but it's also very gracefully written. And I appreciated the style and the lightness that you bring to the way in which you explain difficult ideas very lucidly. So thank you for the book.
Appreciate that.
I wonder if we could begin our discussion of it with you sort of sketching in why you think it's important for early 21st century people to be engaging with Hume. Where does he figure in our thinking today? Are we Humeans? What is Humish about the way that we are today?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, I think it wouldn't be right to say that we're all Humeans now, but there's a sense in which there's a lot of Humeanism about, not so much the original Humeanism, but an evolved form of it. Hume is significant because of the way he brings distinctively skeptical considerations to bear, not just on matters of religion, but all matters. He is one of the most radical of the empiricist philosophers, and his philosophy is in large measure an attempt to work out the implications of empiricism and the limitations of knowledge based on the idea that everything we know about the world, if we know anything at all, comes through the senses. Now that idea, that basic idea that you can only know what you can touch and taste and hear and smell and feel, that kind of empiricism, I think there are a few people today who are as rigorous as Hume in it, but it's pervasive. It particularly appears in the form of scientism, which is propounded at both an academic level and a popular level. So certainly that tendency towards an empiricist view of knowledge is quite pervasive, particularly in the sciences today, not so much in the humanities, although you do find it. But also Hume is sort of a prototypical naturalist. How can we provide a naturalistic account, not just of the planets in their orbits, which Newton largely done, but of the human heart, to put it in somewhat romantic terms, or human nature? What would a scientific, naturalistic account of human nature look like, and what would be the implications? And again, that's very much the spirit of our age in terms of Western culture and academia, assuming that we are naturalistic, that the world is naturalistic, that even if there is such a thing as religion, even if religion has some value, even religion itself needs to be subjected to a naturalistic analysis. And so in large measure, that's not just the mark of Hume that's been left on the culture as we find it today, but also it just has a lot intellectually speaking in common with Hume's outlook, whether there's a direct line of causation or not.
And I think that raises the fascinating question of to what extent philosophers writing books shape societies and shape the way that people think. You know, is Hume reflecting something that was present in his society anyway, sort of zeitgeist that he's simply putting into words, do you think? Or do you think that he is shaping in his own writing the way that people think? In other words, do you think that philosophy matters that much?
Well, if Karl Marx is a philosopher, and if Marxism has had any impact on the world, which of course it has, then clearly philosophy matters, and we could point to other examples. But in the case of Hume, he's not an especially original thinker, in that he's taking certain intellectual currents and I think bringing them into sharp focus. He's rather like a funnel for a particular stream of Enlightenment thought, the more empiricist tradition, and he's trying to work out what would that look like when we make it as consistent as possible, and what are the implications of it? Did Hume intend to have a big impact on culture? Did he have great ambitions? I'm not sure that his expectations were particularly high, but I think his ambitions were quite grand. His first work he describes as an attempt to offer a complete science of human nature. Now, I think even that was a bit of rhetorical overstatement. I mean, even he knew that there were some gaps in his thinking and some details to be worked out. But his project as a whole was an ambitious one, and presumably he thought that if people latched onto this, then it was going to have a lasting impact. It was going to have a lot of influence, and that was certainly his hope.
If we could move on to his impact on secular culture and the way in which Christians engage with Hume. The one sentence in your book really struck me when you wrote, the credibility of Christianity lies upon the refutation of Hume's critique of supernaturalism. And I just wanted to cash that out a little bit. Do you think, therefore, that all Christians need to know and be able to reproduce that critique?
I think that would be asking too much of most Christians. I mean, the reality is that many Christians will not have to engage with a Humean critique of Christianity, although it will be there in the background, and it doesn't hurt to be aware of where some of the modern skepticism that they encounter today has its roots. But I do think that while Hume isn't the first word or the last word in critiques of Christianity in particular, religion in general, he's definitely up there in the top three in terms of names that will be offered when the idea that Christianity is no longer intellectually credible is put forward. That Hume's critique of natural theology, of the arguments for the existence of God, of his celebrated but much overrated argument against miracles and miracle claims is widely cited. I mean, there are many people who will say that Hume's argument is decisive against the credibility of miracle claims. And to a lesser extent, his attempt to offer naturalistic alternatives to religion, so a naturalistic basis for morality, a naturalistic explanation for religious beliefs. All of these, if Christians aren't being directly confronted with Hume's arguments, they are dealing with the tremors that have been caused by them, and so it helps to first of all understand the source, to understand where these ideas are coming from, and have a basic idea of what a Christian response ought to be.
I wonder if we could have a look at some particular curly questions that Christians might get asked that are inspired by Hume, in a sort of quick-fire way. Try and think through what Christian responses to those questions might be. The first is something that you mention in the book, that Hume says that if monotheism were obvious, we would have started with monotheism and not polytheism. What do you think a Christian might respond to that argument?
I think what that fails to take into account is a doctrine of the fall and the corruption of human reason. Now Hume is saying if monotheism were true and obvious, then everyone would accept it. Well, if human beings were perfectly rational and perfectly morally aligned, then that would be true. And indeed, it was true at a certain point of history in the Garden of Eden. There's no question about it. But once we add to that a recognition of the fallenness of not just the human intellect, but the human will, and what Paul lays out in Romans about the suppression of truth in sin and substitution of created things for the creator. we're broadening out the Christian narrative in a way that now Hume's claim no longer becomes obvious or even plausible. He's just not taking into account the full picture as Christians see things. And so the idea that there would have been various kinds of deviations from monotheism into polytheism and pantheism and so forth. In fact, Hume's approach is particularly sort of parochial in that he doesn't even take into account more Eastern perversions of biblical truth. But I think once you embrace the broader Christian narrative, you have a ready explanation and response to the claim that Hume makes there.
Second curveball, it's his famous, the trilemma of which his is one of the famous expressions. So in Hume's terms, it's, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil, says Hume. I'm sure that many Christians, perhaps most Christians, will have faced some version of that question in their time. What do you think is a helpful way of responding to that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to give Hume credit for giving us a particularly pithy statement of the logical problem of evil. That given that there is evil, it seems as though you have only three alternatives. Either God isn't good, or he isn't powerful, or he's not there at all. Because if he were both good and powerful, then he would eliminate evil. The problem is that there's a concealed assumption there, namely that an all-good, all-powerful God would eliminate evil completely. Whereas if it's the case that there are certain goods that can only be accomplished through the permission of evil in the world, that there are certain greater goods that not only presuppose the existence of evil, but also outweigh that evil, then God actually can have a morally sufficient reason, a good reason, a morally justifiable reason for permitting evil. And Hume does acknowledge that to some extent in the dialogues, but he doesn't really take it seriously. And so while his statement of the problem is quite good, I think his analysis of it, he gives in too easily. He doesn't really explore some of the more, I think, robust responses to that trilemma.
Yeah. I wonder whether one way of expressing that would be to say that in order to be confident in all the premises necessary for that statement, you would need to be God yourself, to know that there would be no greater good, for example, and to know that for certain.
That's right. Once you grant the possibility that God could have morally sufficient reasons for permitting evil, that there could be a greater good, then the burden
even if we don't
you.
necessarily know for certain what that would be.
Right. But my argument is that someone in Hume's position, if once they grant that possibility, then the burden lies with them. The burden of argument lies with them to argue that there could not be either reasons in general or good reasons for specific evils that we might point to in the world. And as you observe, one would really have to be in the position of God in order to make that. So ironically, it turns into a proof of God's existence, because you could only justify that claim if there were a God to provide epistemic warrant for it. But of course, neither Hume nor anyone else is other than God would be in a position to really evaluate whether all the evils of the world are such that there could be no justifying reason for God to permit them.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Certainly it's an appeal to mystery, but of course an appeal to mystery is entirely consistent and warranted by a biblical worldview. So there's nothing ad hoc about it for a Christian to appeal to that as part of a response to the problem of evil.
My final curly question, is when Hume, another famous dictum of Hume's, that the wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, and this is part of his argument against miracles and against supernaturalism more broadly. He says, only a counter-experience more persuasive than miracles, than our experience, could convince us of miracles. And he also says that, look, people believe the miracle claims in their own tradition, but they don't believe in miracle claims in other people's tradition. So in other words, it's epistemically reckless to believe in miracles. And if you believe in your own, why don't you believe in others?
Yeah. There's several strands there to Hume's argument. The first is really a kind of a in principle argument against miracles. And there's two components to that. First is this dictum that a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. In other words, you should always follow the weight of evidence. You should always believe whatever has a preponderance of evidence. So you weigh up the evidence for something and against something, and your belief should track that evidential weight. That's the first component. And the second component is his argument that in the case of a miracle, whatever evidence you might have for a miracle based on human testimony, that's always going to be outweighed by the ordinary, regular, cumulative experience of the laws of nature or unexceptional events, because a miracle is by definition, as he defines it, a violation of a law of nature, an exception to a law of nature. But our personal experience is entirely that of regularity, of no exception to the law of nature, and that will always, really, in principle, outweigh any possible evidence that there could be for miracles. So in a sense, he says, you can just rule out miracles in advance. He isn't quite so bold about it, but in effect what he's saying is that no evidence in principle could justify belief in a miracle. But then he moves on in the second part of this chapter of miracles to sort of pile on some additional arguments to do with the credulity of ancient people and dueling miracles. So Christians believe the miracles in their tradition, and Muslims have Muhammad's supposed miracles, and Hindus have theirs. And so I guess what he's arguing there is that everybody has double standards. They apply double standards. They accept the miracles that support their tradition, and they reject the miracles that don't. There's a lot to be said in response to that. I think the first argument, the in-principle argument, is just simply question begging. I mean, it rules out miracles in advance, and it's simply implausible to say that there can never be enough evidence to justify a miracle, no matter how much evidence there might be. And in fact, his argument commits some basic blunders in probability theory, which I won't try our viewers' patience by getting into that, but it's explained as clearly as I can in the book. So he's not even applying probability theory correctly when he makes that argument. But then these supplementary arguments about miracles and other traditions and so forth. I think a Christian actually can say, well, Hume's onto something. There is something in human nature, confirmation bias. It's pretty well documented that we want to believe the things that confirm our position, and we want to reject the things that don't seem consonant with it. But we can say, we can take everything on a case-by-case basis. There are many miracles that are claimed to be part of the Christian tradition that we might end up rejecting, even though in principle they might support our position. The evidence actually isn't good enough. There are various claims of miracles today that are in response to prayer. Some of them maybe we ought to believe, others we ought to be skeptical about, as long as we're applying consistent standards of evaluating evidence. And as for miracles in response to other religious traditions, well, within a Christian worldview, we don't rule out the possibility of ungodly miracles, of demonic influences and so forth. Maybe we just have to withhold judgment, and maybe we have to just suspend conclusions in these cases. Maybe the evidence can be interpreted one way or another. But we don't have to be guilty of applying double standards. We just have to be discerning in the way that we approach evidence, and everybody interprets evidence in terms of their presuppositions anyway. That's true of Christians, that's true of Muslims, that's true of skeptics like Hume. In fact, it's particularly true of skeptics like Hume. He has an incredible philosophical bias against Christian claims. So, everybody's going to interpret evidences in terms of their presuppositions, which means that we probably need to focus more attention on our presuppositions.
You write at one point in the book, if Hume can take empirical naturalism on faith, then the Christian is entirely within his rights to take biblical supernaturalism on faith, and to develop an account of human nature on those terms. And I guess the question that will arise in some people's minds at that point will be, well then, is the Christian position any better than Hume's position, given that they're both taken on faith? Is there any reason to be a Christian? I'm sort of playing devil's advocate rather. Is there any reason to be a Christian rather than a Humean if both positions are taken on faith?
Right. Yeah. So the objection is this some kind of fideistic standoff where Hume has his faith commitments, we have ours, and that's all that can be said about it. I don't think I exactly say that Hume takes his position on faith and we can take our position on faith as well, or at least if that's true, that's definitely not the whole story. My point is that much of Hume's analysis of religion and other phenomena in the world is premised on naturalism. He's not arguing for naturalism. He's effectively assuming naturalism and then arguing from that point. My point is sort of a tu quoque, that if Hume is allowed to do that, then the Christians should be allowed to do that as well. That doesn't mean that that's all there is to say about it, but whatever philosophical biases Hume brings to topics, Christians have a right to bring their own starting presuppositions. But I think there's more to be said, and it has to do with the internal critique of our presuppositions. So what I do later in the book, and you'll know this, is actually try and evaluate Hume's philosophy on its own terms. What I don't do is say Christianity is true, therefore Hume is false, which would be a patently absurd argument to make, or at least it certainly doesn't have any sort of rational apologetic traction. Instead, let's see what happens when you take Hume's position to its logical endpoint. And actually, the beauty of Hume is he does a lot of that for us already. I just don't think he takes the final step. But Hume's position does really reduce to a quite debilitating skepticism in accounting for our knowledge of moral norms, of causal connections in the world, of the reality of the external world, even the existence of other minds than our own. I mean, Hume is notorious for expressing skepticism about these things. And the point is that a Christian worldview doesn't suffer from that kind of self-refuting character. It doesn't undermine our ability to know things about the world. Actually, it explains them. It accounts for why we have knowledge of moral truths, why we are able to formulate scientific laws and make predictions of the future, why we are able to rationally understand a world that we rightly assume to exist beyond our immediate sense experience, and so forth. So if we can take both sets of presuppositions, both worldviews, if we want to call them that, and do a sort of internal critique of each one, we can see that the Christian worldview stands up much, much better than a Humean worldview, or indeed any naturalistic worldview. That's part of my argument.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think it's so important, both in terms of understanding why focusing on presuppositions doesn't lead to fideism, but
Yeah.
also in stressing why it's so important for Christians not always to be on the back foot, simply responding to questions put to them by people who are not Christians, but also to lift the bonnet, lift the hood on non-Christian positions and poke around in their presuppositions and see how it all fits together or doesn't fit together as well. Yeah, so thank you for sketching that out.
Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, right?
I'd love to probe a little bit further into the question of reason. You suggest in the book, when you're sketching Hume's position, that he says that a lot of our beliefs can't be justified by reason. And that led me to thinking, well, what for the Christian should be the role of reason in justifying our beliefs? Should we expect our beliefs to be justified by reason, or should we agree with Hume that a lot of what we believe can't be justified by reason? How big a role do you see reason as playing for the Christian in the justification of beliefs?
Yeah. A lot of it hangs on how we define reason. If we define reason narrowly as the ability to apply logical principles to derive some truths from other truths, so to construct arguments, whether deductive or inductive or any kind, but to extend our beliefs. So if this is true, then that is true, either certainly or probably. If reason is the faculty that allows us to do this, then obviously it's hugely important for extending our knowledge of the world and our understanding of the world. But the sort of the garbage in, garbage out principle applies here, that reason can only do things with the raw materials that it receives. So there have to be certain beliefs that are, excuse me a second, there are some certain starting beliefs that we need to feed reason, and those starting beliefs themselves need to have some sort of epistemic value, some warrant, and reason itself can't produce them. So reason can take us from certain warranted beliefs or justified beliefs to other justified beliefs, but I don't think reason itself can generate starting points for knowledge. They need to come from other sources. Some of those may be perceptions, maybe sense experience. But I think also we need a stock of what we would call a priori beliefs, certain intuitive knowledge, things that we know without any further justification, or we don't know them by inference from other things. And for Hume, that's actually very problematic, the idea that we would have sort of intuitive a priori beliefs. This is, of course, what calls Kant such grief as he realized the implications of what Hume was saying. So there need to be some a priori beliefs that we need, certain things that we know apart from sense experience that reason itself doesn't give to us. And I think only ultimately a theistic epistemology is going to be able to give us that, because in a sense, to put it very crudely, these have to be built-in beliefs. They have to be built-in beliefs that we are, that they're sort of epistemic givens, but they have to be from a reliable source. So the question is, who gives them to us? Who is the builder in of these beliefs that give us these starting points, these anchors for knowledge? On a naturalistic worldview, as I think Hume recognized, there's nowhere to go. There's no answer to that. But on a theistic worldview, there's actually quite a straightforward account of what gives a epistemic warrant to these a priori beliefs.
Yeah, and in the book you have a very helpful discussion of what it means for a belief to be properly basic as well, taking us into a bit of planting and so forth. And I thought that was very, very helpful as a way of conceptualizing the difference between a Christian and a Humean position in relation to reason. So I wonder if we could finish off, James, by you reflecting on what writing the Great Thinkers volume on Hume has brought for you, either in a deeper understanding of Hume himself or in terms of different ways of thinking biblically about philosophy. What has it brought for you?
I think I think there have been two benefits. One is actually a greater appreciation of Hume. It's not as though I've been any more persuaded of Hume's philosophy, quite the opposite, in fact. But I've gained more of a respect for him as a very systematic thinker and uncompromising thinker who's willing to follow through the implications of his starting point. And so he's something of a model in that regard. And he's also a very clear thinker in many respects, and a very, very entertaining thinker. I mean, there's actually a lot of pleasure to be found in reading Hume, if you can set aside the skeptical barbs. But the other thing is, actually, I found that it reinforced my confidence in the Christian faith, because what Hume really does, I think, is he shows us the implications of a naturalistic worldview and the dead-end nature, the skepticism and nihilism that follow. And if that's the alternative to Christianity, if Hume's proposing the alternative to Christianity, as many people think today, and naturalism is a major competitor to Christianity, then Christianity is doing extremely well as a worldview, as a philosophical system, as an account of who we are, where we came from, and what it all means. So in that sense, it was very encouraging and reinforcing of my confidence in my Christian faith.
That's wonderful to hear. And you've completely convinced me to go away and read the Hume volume again, hearing you talk about it so compellingly. So that's what I will do.
All right.
And James, it's been an utter delight talking with you. Thank you so much for taking this time.
Well, thank you, Chris, as well. It's been a pleasure both ways, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to do this again sometime.
I really hope so. Okay, bye.
All right. Bye-bye.